Hello and welcome to the Reconnect Podcast, a weekly show sponsored by the Anasazi Foundation and powered by Sturry Studios. I'm Gaynalyn Condi, your host. I'm so grateful you've joined us, where we have conversations to help you strengthen your most important relationships and reconnect with those that matter most. Hello and welcome to the Reconnect Podcast. I'm Gaynalyn Condi, your host. I am here at the Sturry Studios. We are grateful for the Anasazi Foundation for sponsoring this podcast. If you're new to this podcast, welcome. And if you're part of our family already, I know that you are in for a treat today. Here at the Reconnect Podcast, we are about conversation around connection and about creating reconnection when there is a disconnection. So sometimes we have to circle back in our own personal lives, in our families, in our work experiences, and reconnect. And that's really what we like to tackle here. We love to have guests on that help us reconnect. And today, our guest is the expert on this exact why for the podcast. And I'm so happy you're finally here. Carrie Wrigley.
Thank you.
She is a therapist and author and speaker and a mother and a wife. Are those all the bio things, or did I miss any?
I'm also a songwriter.
That's right.
Yeah.
What I just saw you in a film, didn't I? Yes. Okay, so that's really a fun combination of bio statements about you and what you bring specifically as a therapist, and more recently in a new project that you have out, a book that you just published. Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit, because therapists are needed. We don't have an overabundance. Where we're taping here in Utah, I feel like we have a lot of dentists, but we don't. I feel like every corner there's a dental office.
It's
but
true.
I get a lot of calls and messages because of the work I do about referrals, and the mental health field is in need of good quality mental health professionals. Why don't you share with our audience a little bit about what brought you to that path of becoming a therapist and what you bring to your practice specifically?
Sure. Well, I did start in an artistic field. I got my major in theater.
Okay.
And then I realized that the kind of work I wanted to do is not the kind that tends to get paid, like the fighting preacher.
Yes,
Nobody's
there's
rich
not
on
a
that
lot
movie.
of TC Christensen's out there.
And so I realized that as far as a career path, I'm really grateful for the training and it's something that I love, but I realized I needed to do something also that was going to help pay the bills and all that kind of stuff consistently. So as I went looking, I realized that what brought me originally to acting was a love of people. And in fact, when I was trying to decide on what I was going to, major in college, I thought I'll either study people from the inside by being an actor or study them from the outside by being a psychologist.
Yeah.
So I did the actor thing first, and then later when I would decide what to do with graduate school, I decided to do the second thing and learn how to help kind of from the outside. But it's been an interesting thing, because I think because I was trained first as an actor, there's
you
a level
understood.
Yes, it's my professors actually told me that. It's like, you have a gift for engagement. We rarely see this in our students, because usually they're taking notes on the behavioral whatever. I know what things feel like from the inside. Yeah. First of all, from my own very sensitive nature,
and then characters
secondly,
you played.
Absolutely, characters that I played, and so it's been interesting to have that cross germination, of learning about human beings and expressing the human story in both of those modes.
Yes.
So, and then certainly I dealt with a number of things while I was growing up that were hurtful to me, including the kinds of situations that are expressed in the fighting preacher. I had to find my own course through that, because as rare as therapists are now in Utah, they were even rarer when I was growing up in the 70s. So I had to kind of find my own course,
your own toolbox.
Exactly, my own toolbox. And, without, money, without resources, without whatever, I just had to figure out how to get through it, my particular it. And so when I became a therapist, that's essentially what I wanted to do, was help people. Because, what works for me, one of the things that makes me the happiest is to be on set and memorize lines and do my thing. And you just said that would make you completely terrified, right?
Well, it doesn't make me terrified, because I speak in front of 4,000
Sure.
and that terrifies people. And it is such a sacred space for me, and I love it. It's my joyful spot, right?
And it is your joyful spot. It would be someone else's terror spot.
And people are like, how can you stand up and what, you don't have that written down, right? But the sitting around and the acting and the, that was not my joy spot.
Our joyful spot is different for every person. And so to help, people figure out what is the ingredients for me personally that activate my happiness, and when those things are missing, that activate my sadness, my disappointment, my even depression, anxiety, anger, whatever it is. How do I restore, help restore for that individual in a unique, personalized way, what works for them, which is not, a standardized prescription. It's very, very unique to that individual. I don't have a single client that has the same prescription as any other, as far as behaviors, the thought patterns, the things that help.
Their risk factors, right.
And so, I think one of the things that is kind of unique about the way I work as a counselor, and certainly what's reflected in the book, is that we spend as little time as possible looking at the symptoms and the backstory and
the
how did you get messed up and all that kind of stuff. Enough that I know what they're dealing with and can have compassion for that, and that's a starting place. But then the bulk of the time, we're working to build something that's more happy and more helpful and more functional for
So
them.
before we delve specifically into the book, you, just so I have the chronological map in my head a little bit, were you already a mom and a wife when you became a therapist? Okay, so you went to college, you did the acting thing, and you hadn't delved into this until when? When did that all play?
I actually finished my acting degree. I escaped into the mission field to serve my church for a year and a half, which was a nice kind of reset, and also a time when I learned how to write songs, first in Spanish because I was in Argentina. And so it was kind of an expansion of what I'd done artistically. And then when I came home, I realized I'm going to have bills to pay. I'm going to need And so it was literally after I finished those two things, first the bachelor's in theater and then the mission, that I started. So I was actually single, just a couple years out of my bachelor's degree, right off of my mission when I started my master's degree. And so I was able to finish both my master's and also my clinical license, my LCSW, by the time my first child arrived. I actually met my husband within the first week of graduate school, and so that's kind of how that all happened.
So they were happening. You becoming a mom and a wife was happening simultaneously with your practice,
and there was that. So there's that cross germination as well.
Right.
One of my mentors that wrote a letter of recommendation to help get me into graduate school, who was also a licensed clinical social worker, said one of the things she loved about her profession is that everything that she learns at work, she can apply at home. And everything she learns at home, she can apply to work.
Which is sometimes, my friends that are therapists have often said, though, that they need to almost put on their clinical brain at home, because all of a sudden on a very personal level, you can talk grief, you can talk tools, you can have all the certifications as a therapist that you want. When it is your child dealing with an addiction, when it's your spouse dealing with depression,
when it's yourself dealing with grief,
that's a whole nother place of vulnerability, right? And
absolutely.
And so I love that.
But I find that place of vulnerability
helps you.
Absolutely. Because if I'm just kind of doing the classic, so tell me about your childhood, and I'm completely distant from that, I don't make the kind of connection I did of, so you're experiencing grief and you're experiencing pain and your kid's struggling. You know what? I get that. I totally get that, because I have lived that, and here's some things that helped me, and here's some things that have helped other people, as opposed to kind of this completely detached, so tell me more about your symptomatology.
Right. Yeah, and we've talked here on this show, and I've shared on other platforms, sympathy versus empathy is very much that. Sympathy is this side of the fence, I'm looking over at you, and so sorry you're having a hard day. Empathy is, I can pull from a place inside of me where I remember feeling that kind of grief, that loss, that frustration, that depression or whatever.
Because I've been there and because I've been through it, I can help you manage being here and then getting through it to happier place.
So where's one of the key places that you've experienced some of that propelled you forward into wanting to write this book? And why don't we show our viewers that can see, for those that cannot see, tell us a little bit about this baby. Because book writing is birthing.
Yes.
I've done it 7 times, and it is a birth process.
It is very much, and this is my most recent child, because my other ones all just left home.
Yes.
My actual physical
I'm
child.
halfway through the empty nesting. It's a whole new stage of life, isn't it?
Yeah,
so this is your happiness toolkit, which I love, because I talk about the toolbox and you talk about the toolkit.
Yeah.
And tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so your happiness toolkit, and the subtitle is equally important, 16 strategies for overcoming depression and building a joyful, fulfilling life.
Which is what we need, all of us.
Yeah, because I actually, the first designer that I worked with says, Carrie, that is way too long. You got to get rid of that last part. Just stick with overcoming depression. It's a nice SEO-able keyword.
You're right.
Like, this isn't just about depression.
Right.
This is about overcoming depression and moving on to something else, So, and that's very much the focus. So we talk about in the book about depression and about emotional challenges and so on, and the kinds of factors, the kinds of triggers, the kinds of thought patterns, the kinds of behavioral and relationship factors that can intensify those conditions.
I call them the risk factors. So
absolutely.
why don't you share for those that when I say that word risk factor, they're like specifically with my sister that took her life. And I say, well, she dealt with depression, anxiety. There was a mental health issue within our family. She had a learning disability. These are all risk factors. She had been sexually abused. Risk factors, right? Yeah. So not everybody's risk factor list is the same.
Which is why, the toolkit has to be so customized
right.
to individual. So I've developed a model that I've taught for a number of years that is a 4-phase model I call the diamond. And what you're calling risk factors, I refer to as triggers.
Okay.
And what I find is those relationship triggers, invariably, if somebody's coming in for help with depression, anxiety, addiction, grief, any of that, by definition, they've had at least one of those things happen. Usually recently, sometimes it's been a ways back.
Right.
Or sometimes, as you mentioned, really big things can happen back there, the abuse, the parents' divorce, the shattering experience back then. And it's not until this little teeny tiny thing here and now, that activates the power of all that.
I said that on the way in today to the studio. I was delayed by at least 20 minutes, which is one of my unwanted identities. Being late is not I don't love that. I don't want to be known as the one that was late. And the road was shut down with big rigs in front of me and behind me. So I was literally like in this claustrophobic trap and I felt completely vulnerable. And all of a sudden I started to cry, which I know is all the stockpiling of emotion over the last few weeks being overly scheduled that I haven't dealt with. And so like you said, all of a sudden you're with a client and it's this stuff from here, but it's often triggered by something that just happens today. And then this is the dam.
And what clients will often say to me is, I don't know why I'm so depressed. Honestly, my life is pretty good right now.
Yes.
And I don't really get it because, I had that little fight with my husband last week, or, we got that unexpected bill, or, but I've been through such bigger things in my life. How could I get through that and that and
Interesting.
that? And then be completely immobilized by this dumb little thing that just happened.
And what do you say?
And I basically tell them it's like dominoes, that last little domino, and everything just kind of, So the first part of that diamond is identifying those triggers. Both recent triggers
and past
triggers
that may not be resolved or addressed.
Exactly. And a lot of times people say, I just kind of moved forward from that. I didn't think that mattered. Now I'm dealing with this thing, and now I'm realizing there's connected links. So those triggers basically tend to be in one of these 8 categories.
Okay.
First is grief.
Right.
Obviously, you experience that. I've experienced that. Losing somebody important to you, whether that's through death or suicide or divorce or moving away.
Or, people don't always realize there's a grief process with
and sometimes even more subtle forms of grief. Like, I've experienced recently, my kids aren't dead.
No.
But they're out of the house.
Yeah.
And I'm grieving.
And it's a change of roles.
It's a massive change. Or guys that, most often men, but women too, who retire.
Yes.
And for
their identity.
Decades, grieving their identity and grieving those associations with clients and with with
a routine.
All of that. And even just their sense of identity.
Right.
I have been this person, and people look to me, and I had a reason to put on nice clothes and to get a paycheck, and now I'm puttering around the house all day wondering what's next on Oprah or whatever.
Yes.
So grief is the first thing.
Okay.
And then the second one is transition. This was real news to me, and it helped explain one of the deepest dips I ever experienced. After I finished graduate school, I went into the deepest, darkest depression of my life. Even though I looked forward for decades to being done with school. I see that same thing when someone becomes a mother for the first time, or when the last kid leaves home, or when people graduate from high school.
Or when I come off a busy speaking schedule or finish a book, I've noticed that I have to be a little more tender with myself.
Right.
Because even though you're grateful to be done, there's a letdown or a something. How do you describe that?
Well, with transition specifically, it's like I had this context and I knew who I was and I knew the rules and I had this identity, and now from one day to the next everything's different. If it's
my son just came home from his mission almost a year ago, but from Zimbabwe, right?
Yeah.
So
real common with our missionaries.
Right. Yeah. For those that are familiar with my religious identity and association, right, that my son was in Africa and he came home to a very different culture, a very different environment, very different on every level, and he's almost to the year mark, and I know he's just like,
absolutely.
I keep telling him, you're doing awesome, like everything's new, really, everything is new.
Well, and not only that, with missionaries or others like that, I'm sure while he was in
or
Zimbabwe,
the military,
well, as a missionary or in the military or whatever, that young person, wears the uniform of that role, and people treat them with respect,
and he
all
knew
of a sudden
his
their elders
responsibility.
Very clear purpose, very clear rules, very clear way to spend your time. And the next day you get home, you're like, wait, I'm supposed to walk down the street by myself now? And I'm supposed to date girls? And just kind of re-immersion back into... So transition in general, and even happy transitions. Grief always involves transitions. Divorce and death, all obviously life changes.
Right, so I was going to say there's an overlap there.
Absolutely. But even transitions that you would think are these happy things we
You're
all look
married.
forward to.
You're
getting married, getting
you have
retired,
that baby. You've been
the baby.
trying.
I think a lot of what we call postpartum depression
is transition.
Assume it's all about hormones. It's not just about hormones. It's about my entire life changed. My marriage changed.
I can't just go to the bathroom anymore. Right. I can't just go to the grocery store anymore.
Exactly. Everything's different.
Everything's different.
And so when all the rules and all the identities and all that changes all at once, that's the second trigger. And I think that's one of the most common non-identified, because obviously if somebody dies, well, of course you feel sad, but you just graduated from high school. Why is there a big trauma? Or you just got home from your mission finally and you get to see your family again? How is that sad?
Or military,
but it is that kind of life is suddenly different in every way. So that's the second trigger. The third kind of trigger is conflict. Most commonly interpersonal conflict, and the most common version of that, of course, is spousal conflict, husband and wife. But it can be, parent-child. It can be, a fight I'm having with my best friend. Quite frequently with my teenage or preteen kids, it's the little dramas, that they're learning about on TV from following the Kardashians or whoever, and all of a sudden you're doing Kardashian dynamics.
If you were only listening on podcast, you couldn't see my eye roll. So I'm just letting you know I eye rolled right there. Yeah.
And so especially, I think that's one of the things driving so much distress for our kids is they're having adult level conflict
drama played out
while they're
in their
still
earbuds.
Children and they haven't figured out, So which leads to our next one, the fourth. I mentioned before I move on from conflict. Most commonly, as I mentioned, conflict is interpersonal between person A and person B. But sometimes the most distressing conflicts are intrapersonal conflicts between me and me. I know I should do this, but I kind of want to do this. I know I want to be 10 pounds lighter, but that cheesecake sure looks good. Or, one of the most pressing things, addiction. Addiction. I know I shouldn't drink that drink, or I shouldn't look at that pornography, or I shouldn't eat that donut, or I shouldn't, but I just need to feel better for just a minute. I just need to, whatever. And I'm naturally more of an introverted person. I like hanging out with one person at a time, have a lot of time to myself. But I grew up in a family that was like, you need to be out there with the people. You need to be extrovert. You need to care about other people. Why are you so selfish? And so I'm like, I should be out there. But inside, I just want to stay inside and play the piano or read the book or do whatever. And so that I should be like this, but really I'm like this, and I'm supposed to want this, but really I need this, and those kind of intrapersonal conflicts I find to be really, really common. And most often, again, there's not even, we spent more time in these last, 5 or 10 minutes talking about these triggers, and we're not even halfway through the list, than most people spend with their, their mental health provider or their doctor or their whoever. Or even
realizing it. I think part of mental health, that's the biggest step, is self-awareness. Exactly. And so if you don't even know, that's why I think therapy, I always say therapy is like a great education for all that matters the most, the insides and the people.
Because what I find is, even with this first step of just identifying those triggers, well, of course you hurt because this and because that and because that. People are like, oh wait, it's okay for me to feel like I do.
So what are the rest of those triggers on it?
So next one is number 4 is lack of interpersonal skills. Now when I first started, I thought that one was pretty rare. I don't think that anymore, because in this day and age, almost all of us
are right there.
Here's our interpersonal skills right here, and if I look at you at all, it's through the filter.
Right.
And with our kids growing up with these things in front of
or how to have a conversation now, like we're ramping up for another political season, and so everything that we categorize as interpersonal is online posting and responding and replying, which is really not. It's, have you sat down, and I've tried to invite a number of guests on this show specifically to say, are you having conversations with someone that looks different than you, worships different than you, votes different than you? If you haven't had that blessing, then seek after it, because that's a skill that we are losing.
Absolutely.
Everybody on our feed is our friend by choice, and then we become homogeneous about everything that we're doing.
And so we've lost, even in the last 5 years, the ability to engage in mutual, two-way, respectful discourse.
Yeah.
Now, here's what I think. Now I'm curious what you think.
Right.
Oh, really? That's
disagreeing without being disagreeable.
Or even not disagreeing, but it's like, wow, my world just got expanded by what I just heard you say. And that connected with this, it's like the difference between a telescope versus binoculars.
Yes.
You know, you can see so much more from more than one point of view.
Right.
But yeah, we're becoming a society of, I self-select my iTunes, I self-select, what I watch on YouTube, I self-select my friends, I self-select my whatever, and so I have this confirmation
And then when all
bias.
of a sudden something's happening that doesn't fit within the self-select categories that you enjoy and love, you're ballistic.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing...
Or you isolate.
Right. And the other thing that happens with that is when I'm used to a world where I find what I want and I just pick it and it immediately arrives to me, but then I'm having a conversation with you and you're my daughter or my spouse or my child, and guess what? That other person wants different things, then I'm not going to immediately get what I want by definition, because there's more than one set of things going on.
Really good point.
There's
really
a
good
lot
point.
of things that I think at all ages
is a trigger.
Well, yeah, because we're being trained to interact with machines that obey us instantly, rather than with people that we have to work out a respectful mutual relationship
where
with.
we have to delay our gratification.
Right. Yeah. And the younger the person, sadly, the more they've grown up in this world, rather than in a world where we're still normally to look people in the eyes and have a heart-to-heart conversation, So I think that's becoming more and more common of a trigger, that lack of interpersonal skills.
And for our listeners, we had Jessica from The New Normal on, and there's some great research happening right now about early technological investment in our child and what that does to their mind and their interpersonal. And so I think it's worth, even as an adult, like all of a sudden this morning I got up and I have a practice in the morning that I go through, and all of a sudden I checked one thing on my phone, and 45 minutes later I'm like,
it can hijack your life. It really does. And it can hijack our relationships. And pretty much every client I have, whether they're coming in for depression, anxiety, anger, marriage problems, addiction, almost without exception.
Technology is one of the factors.
It is one of the factors.
Yeah.
And it's one of the first things that we trim back significantly, because almost always it's feeding the very problem that they're paying me to help them resolve.
So I really want to get to some of the tools that you really... Yes. So let's finish this list of triggers.
So the list of triggers, so we've talked about grief, we've talked about transition, we've talked about conflict, lack of interpersonal skills. Next on the list, you mentioned, is abuse or violence. Obviously, that's a huge trigger. That's the most powerful destructive trigger. Next is loss. Grief is more specific to losing people. Loss can be anything. Loss of my figure, loss of my health, loss of an opportunity, loss of a dream, loss of our home, loss of, it can be anything, and obviously there's
loss
billions.
of a job.
Billions of opportunities for that. Injury or illness can be a significant trigger, partly because it almost by definition involves
all those other...
Exactly, right. Your life completely changes when you get an illness or disabled.
And if you have a chronic illness, I have experienced lupus, and that factor triggered other factors of infertility and interpersonal relationships that I couldn't show up the way. And then all of a sudden you're like, wait, I have to change my schedule, or I'm late, or it's probably why my unwanted identity. We're not going to do my therapy right now, but.
And then the eighth, which I think is the most common, is just plain old disappointment. I thought this would happen instead this would happen. I thought marriage would be like this instead it's like that. I thought I'd be married by the time I was 25 instead I'm still single, or 45 or 85. I thought that having children would be like this instead it's like that. I thought our government would be like this instead. And so whenever there's a disconnect again between our expectations and reality, there's disappointment. And that happens to us all the time.
It's so interesting. I have been practicing awareness around disappointment the last 2 months.
Yeah.
And I don't like it, and I realized how often I haven't allowed myself the experience of just being disappointed, because I tend to want to go to problem solving, and disappointment tends to be, can you just sit in the disappointment? And I think it's worth having another whole podcast episode just on disappointment, because I think we're not comfortable with disappointment. Yeah. We want to see the solution. Right. We want to move forward. We don't want to just sit in the disappointment. And sometimes that's all we need to do is say, I give myself permission to feel disappointed. So,
well, it's such an important point. I think not just about disappointment, but about grief, about pain, about sorrow. We've sort of disallowed legitimate pain.
Right.
Carl Jung decades ago said, all neurosis is a substitute for legitimate suffering. We're not allowing ourselves legitimate suffering. We're
Well,
not
listen.
allowing ourselves to feel the normal pain
Right.
that comes from these normal triggers. And so we think we have to medicate it. We have
Right.
to, distract ourselves from it. We have to avoid it. We have to escape it. And so we get the immersive novel, or we go into the pornography, or we eat the donuts, or we do something, anything, or we go on medication for decades. Anything to make us not feel what we feel. But the downside of that is when we don't feel what we feel, then we also don't feel the joy that we feel. We don't feel the affection that we feel.
Yes,
we don't feel
the
hope
other
that we
side of
feel.
that coin is that you shut down the bad, you also shut down the good.
Yeah.
And Brene Brown often says that we're a society of addiction to numbing more than
Yes.
anything. I mean, we
Yes.
could take all of the
That
vices
really is, yeah.
and the whatever and
That's what it
pare
all goes
down.
down to, is I don't want to feel what I feel.
And it's
right now.
interesting, at the time of this taping in the news this week, Meghan Markle has had a huge backlash on social media because as a royal, she's been criticized that she, on a documentary, admitted, and I'm going to do a whole episode just on my feelings on this, but she admitted how hard it's been to get married. All the things you just named, okay?
Yeah.
To get married, to become a royal, to live in England, right? To have a new baby,
Transition after
to
transition
have
after transition.
British tabloids following you around.
Yeah.
And writing lies
Which
about
often
you.
is abuse in a different
It
kind of
is,
form.
right.
Yeah.
So the abuse she has received for admitting on camera that she's had a hard time, because this reporter said, "How are you doing?"
Mm-hmm.
And she said, "Thanks for asking. It's been really hard."
Yeah.
Wow.
Because we all dream of being the princess.
Right, right.
But for the real
so
princesses,
the
yeah.
online bullying about her, how dare a princess, when there's real suffering happening in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I did a post on my social media platforms yesterday saying, in all the questioning about mental health and suicide numbers, we have, all of us, the opportunity to create safety around saying to someone, it is safe for you to say, I'm not okay today.
Right.
You don't have to agree with why. You don't need to say, oh, that would be hard for me too. But can you agree that all of us have hard times? And is it okay in our society to say, I'm just not doing very well?
Rather than, I'm going to post this
Yes.
wonderful thing today
Yes.
that is a substitution for my
Right.
actual life. I'm going to post
Right.
all my prettiest pictures and all my happiest moments, and this is the new me.
Right.
Really, this is the me.
Right.
And we hide behind these
Right.
things until we don't connect.
And we don't give each other permission. We're like, immediately, because Meghan Markle is a public figure, we think we get to have a commentary
Right.
on, she doesn't have room for that.
Yeah.
Well, all the lists of triggers that you just named off, she's experienced a good chunk of them.
Right.
I guarantee you she's
Absolutely.
dealing with human struggle right now.
Yeah.
Like, regardless if you live in a castle or not,
Yeah.
you're a human being, and we're
Yeah.
not treating each other that way
Right.
anymore. We're not saying,
And that's the first
we're
thing I
dehumanizing
find.
each other.
That's the first thing I find, whether I'm the therapist or I'm dealing with a friend or you're dealing with whoever,
Right.
to validate legitimate pain, to make it safe
That's
to
it.
talk about what we actually are feeling is the first step to healing in whatever context, whether
Right.
it's a professional one or whether it's a personal
Right.
one. Rather than having to pretend we're something we're not and pretend we're not feeling what we actually feel, to make it safe to be who we are, to feel what we feel, is one of the first tasks of that healing process, and of not just preventing suicide, because I know that's a big thing for you, but preventing the depression, preventing the addiction, preventing the numbing that almost inevitably
feeds into
that.
So in the 4 categories,
Uh-huh.
those are your trigger list.
That's the trigger. That's the top of the diamond.
And then what's
Then the next thing is, because all of us have these things happen.
Right.
There's not a single human
Right.
being that doesn't have any of those throughout their entire life. We all have those trigger experiences. It isn't so much what happens to us as what we think about what happens to
the
us.
story we tell ourselves about
Absolutely,
what
the
happened.
story, the interpretation of those events, because if I have graduated again, from my master's program, and I say to myself, "Wow, the world is my oyster, and I'm going to move ahead, and I have all this time now available."
Right.
So that's a completely different picture than, "Wow, I've got nothing to do, and
Yes.
nobody needs me anymore." And
Right.
well, I just probably wasted all those 20 years that I've been working so hard. What was I working for so hard? I mean, it's the exact same situation, but the way I talk to myself.
And this
about that
isn't
situation is so crucial.
Pollyanna. This
Mm-mm,
isn't
no.
saying just paint everything with rose-colored glasses.
not.
It's saying, do you have someone, specifically a therapist, a good friend, a spouse, whatever, that you can check that story? This
Yeah.
morning I called a friend that I needed to check the story. I knew I was telling myself a story about a lot of things, and it was starting to pile up, and she was like super clear from this outside perspective, right?
Yeah.
So
Which is why it's so important to be real, because You know, your sister, for example,
Yes.
when she took her, she honestly believed she was a burden.
Yep.
And all these things she'd been through and all these, you know,
Right.
that she was just taking up space and you guys would all be better off. And that was so completely different
Right.
than the reality of even years later, it still hurts like
Right.
crazy. That
And
she's
I
gone.
think and I think specifically for our listeners that may be having suicidal ideation, I often will repeat this over and over when I speak or any chance I get. That is the big distortion
Yes,
lie,
it
is that we would be better without you.
Uh-huh.
We will never be better without you. But I will validate, and I think this leads perfectly into what you really try to do in your practice and specifically with this book, that those that struggle, like for my sister, it was most of her life, right? So at the age of 40, when people say why, we're not
Why
talking...
did you suddenly get...
Yes, yeah.
It's not sudden.
With 16-year-olds, their frontal cortex isn't developed, and in 15 minutes, that's what the research shows, they make a decision to take their life. A 40-year-old woman who has been in therapy, who has tools in her toolbox, but starts to get tired, it is a very different conversation about a very complex issue. And I think your approach to saying, not only are we overcoming this depression, but are we moving towards a place where that toolkit has the tools that on one day, one of my tools doesn't work, right? And I have to go back. I literally say this in one of the messages I share, that you go back to the toolbox and you say, this isn't working, and then you go to the next one. And that resilience and those life skills, what do you say to people when they come to you and say, I've tried everything, and there's nothing you can do?
I show them that there's 16 tools with infinite variations. And if, like you said, you know, what we tend to do is we keep doing the same thing and the same thing and the same thing, and then it doesn't work for us anymore.
Right.
You know, some people do it with medication, some people do it with a particular friend or whatever. So exactly, expand the options in the toolkit is super important. I have yet to meet anybody who already knew everything in this book.
Right.
Never. I mean, this is what I've learned from 30 years, and there's always another idea. And so to keep learning, to keep expanding that toolkit.
And I define that as hope. I have a friend that's
Absolutely.
a therapist that taught me that hope isn't a feeling, it's a plan B. And so you have 16 plan Bs.
Yes, I do.
What are your 3 top ones that if you were, because we can't go to all 16, but people can find this book where?
It's certainly on Amazon.
Amazon,
and
okay.
That's probably the major place, and also Barnes & Noble.
Okay, great. Wonderful. So what are your top 3 when you have a client that comes in and they have exhibited a number of those triggers and now they're in the place that you were just talking about with us, then do you go right to the tools, or is there another step before that?
One of the first things I have them do, and it's the first thing I have people do in the book, is something called the wellness grid, you know, which is basically I have them take a blank piece of paper, make a vertical line, make a horizontal line, and then in one of the quadrants I have them label it mental, physical, spiritual, social. And I have them just kind of brainstorm about things that at some point they've enjoyed in each of those 4 categories.
Enjoyed.
Things, you know, and even if they're like, well, I'm too depressed, I can't enjoy anything. If they make the list, then there's at least something on there in some minor, minuscule way.
So you focus on what they enjoy.
Yes, what they enjoy and what brings them, you know, a sense of calm and hope. And, you know, and then once they make their list, then there's something on that list that's customized to them. Because again, their list is going to be different than you or I or anybody else.
So
and they've got,
give us an example in each of those 4 that Carrie Wrigley would put.
Okay, for me?
Yes, physical.
Physical, do yoga.
Okay.
Do Zumba.
Okay.
Do hip-hop abs, my little guilty pleasure. Go to the gym and lift.
Okay.
Climb a mountain.
Okay. So moving your body.
Moving my body. Cleaning a room.
Yes.
You know, there's something about physically cleaning a room.
Yeah, vacuum is my favorite therapy because you watch the carpet actually change. What about spiritual?
Spiritual, for me, I love mountains. There's nothing more spiritual for me than being at the top of the mountain. But in addition to that, I do have some religious practices. I do enjoy praying. I do enjoy journaling of my life story, you know, studying inspirational literature, listening to inspirational music. Creating inspirational music is real important for me. You know, that's one of the most powerful things for me personally. Is when
because it regrounds you to that joyful place.
Exactly. You know, and just there's something about creating something rather than just consuming stuff that is very joyful.
What about mental?
Mental, reading a good book.
Okay.
One of my favorite things is to make a plan. You know, because I
the
find
list.
because once it's out of my head and it's on paper, I don't have to worry about all those things anymore. And I can look at the paper and I can say, okay, so I have to do all of these things. And actually, this 4-grid thing is actually one of my favorite ways to make my plan too. Here's what I need to do physically, spiritually, socially, and so on. Once it's out there, then I can, color code it and decide what I need to do first and second and third, what's, priority.
Yeah.
And just, again, to take the weight off of here and put it on paper so that I can...
So it's out of you.
Right, so I can focus on what I really, really need to do today rather than worrying about everything that I can't get to today.
And personal. Is that social?
Social is the last one. Social may be cry to my husband.
Yeah.
Talk to a friend.
Connection.
Hang out with my sister. Get together with family, go serve somebody. Actually, in the book, I talk about 3 dimensions of connection, which are seeking, sociality, and service. Seeking is seeking for help from somebody who knows more and is capable of more than me. That might be through a book, that might be consulting with an expert or a religious leader or a teacher, somebody else I can
an advisor, coach,
Somebody who knows more than me is stronger than me. That's seeking. And it's really important. We start doing that as
I call
little kids.
them, in my book, You Are More Than Enough, You Are Magnificent, faith friends. So if your faith specifically is filling, but those are usually people that have gone through their own trigger lists, right?
They're kind of mentors.
Yeah.
So that's people above me.
Right.
Then sociality is people on the same level as me. So that's peers and colleagues and friends and my spouse and people who are, they're not above me, they're not below me, they're kind of in the same space that I am. Right. They can understand kind of what I'm going through. They're about the same age or the same education level. And then service, of course, is that, that other rung of I have something,
You don't have anything to give back, but I have something to give you.
Right, exactly. You're less fortunate than me, and so I give something to you. Sometimes when we're reaching out, we get stuck in one of those boxes. Some people will get stuck in the seeking box. I need, and they tend to push people away. I've been there. Some people get stuck in the sociality box, and they just kind of look for support with peers.
They're just hanging out all the time.
Right, they're just hanging out. They're not really learning how to do anything different because everybody knows the same thing that they know. Some people get stuck in the service box. It's like, I'm of value if I help you and if I give to you, and I don't really ever need anything. And so having a balance between seeking, sociality, and service.
I love that. I love that. That is a huge, I hope our listeners are really zoning in on that, because I fall into some of those, but I also love people that I'm like, why are you always the giver? And you can see they need a therapist or they need a coach right now.
Yeah, that balance is so very important.
So after you do this assessment, then what's the next step?
Well, again, the assessment is first the triggers, then the thoughts, then behaviors, including, the things that are on the wellness grid.
Okay.
Then impact on spirituality, and then rolling back around to relationships, because when we're engaged in negative thinking, negative behavior has a negative impact on how we feel inside of us. Inevitably, it's going to feed into behavior. So into relationships, how we treat other people. Most commonly, if we're feeling down, we're either going to pull away from other people, which is the most common thing, or we're going to attack and be mean to other people. Mm-hmm. Either way, that's going to be a new stress in that relationship that can send that whole, spiral us into a whole reiteration of that diamond. So the first thing is to identify.
Right.
Then secondly is to replace, how else could I learn to deal with that trigger experience, with my grief, with my conflict?
So what would be one? What would be one of the tools that you would suggest to deal with that?
With grief specifically? This is one I found in the midst of my own grief when I lost my son. I call it the 4 F's.
Okay.
I lost my son halfway through a pregnancy, but he was enough part of our family that we had a name. We'd figured out a place for him. And when we lost him, we were just like, what?
It was a grief. It was extreme. And it was such a personal grief. It's one thing if your baby is born and then it dies, and then everybody comes to the funeral and brings you casseroles and stuff like that. This is such a personal grief. Where do you put that grief?
As a therapist, I quote helped people with grief for years. Well, here's the 5 stages of grief. First, you're going to deny, then you're going to, and that was helpful to know that my feeling bad was normal, but it didn't help me through it. So what I found, it just literally came to me. I literally think it was whispered to me
from God,
from God, or from this angel baby that has been sort of guiding me ever since, including through this.
Yeah.
So the 4 F's are, I'll tell you the 4 words first, and I'll tell you what they mean. Face, feel, free, find. Okay, now I'll go into the detail. Face the reality of the difficulty and all its consequences. That it really is as bad as it really is.
Okay.
See, we don't want to do that. We want to numb it. We
don't want to be disappointed inside.
Right. So face is the first, and you can't heal anything you can't face.
Okay.
The second thing is feel. We talked about this, a few minutes ago. Feel your feelings, all of them.
All of them.
Feel your pain. Feel your disappointment. Feel your anger. Feel your anxiety. Feel your joy. Feel your hope. Feel your, affection.
And
feel your
feeling
passion.
doesn't mean you offload on someone.
No.
It's giving yourself permission to feel.
Yeah. And a lot of that can be done through journaling, I find, and through prayer.
Right.
Those I think, are the 2 safest places.
Or on top of a mountain.
Or on top of a mountain. Yeah. Free yourself from thoughts and behaviors that make it worse. You know, again, you know, if I'm thinking, oh, it's all my fault that my husband
Drinking all the time is not going to help.
No. Drink. So to get rid of both the thoughts and the behaviors that make, you know, that grief problem worse is the third step. And then the fourth, this is my favorite.
Okay.
Find yourself, God, and others more deeply through this difficult experience.
Which you and I have talked about is our why.
Yes, we have, you know, because find yourself, you know, I think it's only when we go through our deepest, most difficult challenges that, you know, it's one of the reasons we have this little dark mountain and the sun coming up. You know, it's in those dark mountains of our lives where it feels impossible to get through or take another step. That's where we find our real strength to find that next step, or to find that, you know, even if it's the next step is nothing but God help me, or reaching out to somebody, or putting our one foot in front of the other, that next thing, or whatever it is. We find things in ourselves through those difficult experiences that we don't find when everything's going happy for us.
Well, I said something to my husband the other day, because we've been married 28 years, and that means there's been layers of everything. I call it the Thanksgiving feast versus fast food restaurant relationships, right? Sometimes the potatoes are lumpy, sometimes the pie got burned, sometimes the, you know, whatever, the green beans were soggy, right? But there also have been times where it's beautiful because it's a feast of experience. And I think it's the same with whether you're married or not. It's that you come to know you come to know God, you come to know others in a deeper way. If you're in the midst of this wilderness experience now, it doesn't feel that way. You know, we want the pain to stop and we want the dark to go away. And, but I think it's important.
Always afterwards. We have to get to the after to see the benefit of the force.
And I think that's why podcasting has become so popular, because you can put those earbuds in. And my prayer has always been, we pray right before we tape, that the people that need to hear that message, that are in the middle of their grief, have heard, Carrie, you say those 4 Fs. Right? Yeah. Or hey, they have heard you list one of their triggers and they have a new awareness and self-compassion. Oh, that's why I'm in this place right now.
And it's okay to be there.
And it's okay to be there.
This is legitimate pain that I need to get through to get to the other side.
Or wait, I find myself giving to all my neighbors, but I'm not getting a coach in my life. I'm giving to my family. I'm giving to my neighbors, but that isn't the connection I'm lacking. I'm needing a different kind of connection. Or I'm constantly talking to my therapist, but I don't show up at the soup kitchen to help anybody. And so it's all about me and me and me. And I'm not giving anything else out there. I feel like what's so great about a book, and I'm so glad that you've put these 30 years of experience as a therapist, as a mother, as a wife, as a daughter, a sister, and all of that into a book, because I still believe the power of pages. So grateful that you have taken your own losses and your own struggles and your own wisdom and knowledge and allowed us to have this conversation and put it in a book, because books live long and they can be there when we need them. Any last message you want to share before we sign off to anyone that's listening? I feel like this is when God directs the final closing thought, and I don't orchestrate it, because it's always I find out later that was the listener that needed to hear. So is there anything on your heart or mind that you want to leave before we say goodbye?
The major thing I want to leave is, no matter how dark it seems today, there's always hope. Hang in there, because no matter how dark tonight is, it's just a matter of hours before that sun comes up over that mountain, you know. And there are things that you can do, even if you think you've tried everything. Keep looking for a few more ideas. Keep trying a few more things, because there's none of us that already know everything that might possibly work. You know, most people I talk to that think they've tried everything have tried 2 or 3 things over and over and over and over and over and over again, or different variations. I've tried every medication there is. Well, okay, so there's lots of other options.
So maybe we need to try yoga and meditation today.
Yeah. So there's always hope. And hope, I loved what you said before.
Hope isn't a feeling, it's a plan B.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, plan B and C and D and E. And,
Yeah, plan B is the placeholder for just trying again.
Plan B 1, 2, plan B 2. You know, there's
and that's really where we, when you meet the most hopeful people, it's because they've given themselves permission to try again. And I think giving each other permission to say, it didn't work. This isn't working. Things aren't working. That is the why for the Reconnect podcast. Because we could have just named it the Connect podcast, but I really love the idea that we reconnect. We come back and we keep circling back. We keep saying, I've lost connection with me. I've lost connection with my physical self, my emotional self, my spiritual self, my mental self, and I need to reconnect back to that.
Sure, because we can't connect with anybody else if we haven't connected with us.
Absolutely.
And we can't connect with us if we're constantly numbing and distracting and escaping.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your heart and your sensitivity and your vulnerability. I think it makes for a great therapist that they come from an empathetic place, and I can see that that's what your clients get. And I'm grateful that I throw every dart at the dartboard to address depression and suicide. And I'm grateful there's something else out there that we can advise and suggest to people. And I hope people will find Carrie M. Wrigley, Your Happiness Toolkit. If you're watching this on video, you'll see the cover. If not, I hope you can hear my voice on Amazon as an option to plan B it.
Right, and one other thing you might want to know is sometimes when people are really down to like 16, that's so overwhelming.
Yes, they do one.
They do one. And so here's something I just added to my website yesterday, carriewrigley.com. I just barely added a 6-page little guideline to the top 5 quick start strategies you can start doing by the end of the day to start feeling better today.
I love that.
Yeah. So and that has pictures, and it's very easy to digest.
Yes.
So if it's like, oh, this huge book, I can't even get up and go to the bathroom, download that little thing, because you just the homepage on my website at carriewrigley.com.
I often say my quick fix is watching a few minutes of Elf when Will Ferrell was walking around New York City chewing gum that's already been chewed. You can't be sad for at least 10 whole minutes. So sometimes it is just taking a quick walk, or it's laughing or whatever. So I definitely will go and check out your website.
Share one other thing too. When I first started teaching this kind of approach,
right,
which was at a religious university where I taught every year, I had one little lady that came to me after. She said, I have been to every class on depression that has been taught at this university, and I swore to myself I would not go to another class, I would not read another book, because I just came out more depressed. Like, chemical imbalance, you're going to struggle with this forever, and the only way you can manage it is through our product. Blah, blah,
Carrie,
blah.
I know where you're going, and I'm so glad we would have ended without saying this. This is what I really wanted to bring out today.
So she said to me, after hearing your class, and she was crying when she said this, she says, this is the first time I felt hope. Hope that I haven't tried everything. Hope that there's a whole bunch of other ideas. There's hope that, as I recognize, as I identify, and then replace, and then assimilate these different changes, I can build something different than I've ever known before. Even if I came from 15 generations of abusive and alcoholic and horrible, blah, 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 I can build something today here in the present by learning what works versus what doesn't work.
Thank you.
So that, like I say, the message is hope.
we need to have a different conversation about suicide, depression, anxiety, that there's an ability that we all have to inspire resiliency and learn new skills. So
suicide prevention is nice to have somebody call at the end of a hotline, but ultimately what we need is depression prevention.
Yes, because for my sister, she got tired. And what we need people to hear when they're listening to this conversation between you and I is that, yes, you may have this list of risk factors, right? We validate that. Yes. But you also have a list
of things to build in their place.
So that you can build hope and joy back into your life.
Tiny little increment at a time.
Yes, and build your own toolbox, and it will be specific for you, but there is hope. Thank you, Carrie. Thanks for being with us. And thank you again for joining us today at the Reconnect Podcast here at the Story Studios. And thank you again, Anasazi Foundation, for making this podcast possible. Please share this episode specifically with those that you love and care about that may be struggling with a disconnection with themselves or others, because they may be fighting some of the losses and triggers that we've discussed today. And please join us again here at the Reconnect Podcast, where connection with those that you love the most and yourself is our priority.
Thank you for listening to the Reconnect Podcast, presented by Anasazi Foundation. Are you worried about your teenager? Are they struggling with depression, low self-esteem, anger, drugs, or suicidal thoughts and feelings? If so, Anasazi Foundation can help. Anasazi is a wilderness therapy program for at-risk youth, and our mission is to help turn hearts homeward. To learn more about us, please visit anasazi.org. If you liked this show, please be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. Thank you again.